tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Now, as far as why I'm so aghast by maybe that's a strong word. Certainly, why I'm so frustrated by the inability of Canadian society to have this conversation is because when you do have issues where social conservatives have been the ones leading the charge on very significant issues, like, for example, against the expansion of assisted suicide in Canada, you get the same people who just completely do not want to engage in any question about life that try to shut it down. This is an issue, just to remind you of some context. I've talked about this in the past, so I'm going to give the 45-second summary here. I have a belief in life as a Christian, but I also, as someone who survived a very nearly successful suicide attempt more than 14 years ago, or almost 14 years ago, I have a hugely deep connection to this idea that what the Liberals are doing is atrocious in trying to expand access to assisted suicide, to euthanasia, to MAiD, whatever you want to call it, to people who are struggling only with a mental illness, not someone with MS whose life is coming to its natural end as it is, but people who may get up one day and decide they don't want to end their life, and instead of them being treated for that, they are met with the government helping them with it. This is my concern about someone with a serious depression, for example, in a regime like what the Liberals are pushing Canada towards. This has been, among other issues connected to assisted suicide, been put under the microscope by a new documentary produced by the Rebel News crew, specifically Kian Simone and Sheila Gunn Reid. Here's a little glimpse at this.
And I said, how did they come to the conclusion that I was going to die? He said, because they didn't really know what to do with you.
The government of Canada is killing Canadians, and not just a few, and not just the terminally ill. Over 50,000 so far. 50,000!
There is a startling new development in the ongoing controversy around veterans being offered medical assistance in dying.
Instead of help, are you familiar with our MAiD program? He said, well, it's better than blowing your brains out against the wall.
They essentially evicted us from our buildings because we would not participate in this government euthanasia program.
Canadians are expecting us to get the job done.
Fraser Health is refusing to give information, and because of that, the police investigation had to close. Therefore, Fraser Health is covering information up.
And we know for a fact that our people in power do not take responsibility for anything. Right. So it's a financial save, a lack of responsibility, and then it's completely easy to just offer it to vulnerable individuals, and then they're going to take it.
That is a clip of the trailer for MAiD, The Dark Side of Canadian Compassion. It came out a couple of weeks ago. The reason I didn't want to do an interview about it is because I wanted to see it first, and I had to wait to do that because I knew they were coming to Elmer, Ontario, a lovely little town not far from me, and I saw it last week at long last, and I didn't make the trailer, but I am in the documentary. I did an interview with Sheila and Kian, which I was very grateful to do, talking about my own experience here. Sheila Gunn Reid, the editor-in-chief of Rebel News, joins us now. Sheila, I know you've done quite the tour on this, so congratulations and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's been a grueling tour, but I think the documentary has been well received, and sometimes we're sort of met with shock because people who are fundamentally opposed to the government helping you off this mortal coil are surprised at just how bad it is out there. When we decided to make this documentary, and we put a call out for stories, but we also put a call out for fundraising. We did this all entirely without any government help, unlike many documentaries made in this country. But our emails were sort of inundated with people from two sides of the debate. We had people saying, you guys, it's definitely not as bad as you say it is. This is just for people who are in unbearable suffering at the end of their life, and who are we to say that they should suffer more? And then the other 50% of our emails were saying, it's so bad, but it's much worse than you think, and here's my outrageous story. And we thought, boy, we've got to use the 50% of these people to inform the other 50%. And it was the reason the documentary sort of came to life the way it did.
You touch on this there, and I think the documentary deals with this complexity to some extent as well. There's more of a spectrum of opinions on this than a binary. I mean, you certainly have your people that are against any MAiD whatsoever, any assisted suicide whatsoever. And then you get people on the other side that, the quote unquote dying with dignity people that basically think it should be no different than, ordering a book off Amazon. You just one day say, I want it. There are a lot of shades of gray in this. And people that, for example, would have no issue or at least no legal issue with someone that fits how it was originally presented, someone who is terminally ill, they're in a lot of pain, people know with near certainty they're going to die, things will not improve, and they voluntarily and of sound mind make the decision, versus what we're seeing now, which is an expansion to minors, potentially an expansion to people who have a mental illness, which is by definition a disease of the mind. So you've raised your hand there and acknowledged, where you fit on this. But how do you deal with that issue of where there are people that, are fine with it to a point, but not the point that the government is taking it?
We included their voices in the documentary. We tried to make the documentary as accessible as possible for
Well, and I should
people.
say your co-producer himself is not as black and white as you are on this.
That's exactly it. And that's why I love working with Kian, is because he comes to these documentaries with a very open mind. He's there to learn, he's there to listen. And, as I do with everything at Rebel News, I lead with my chin. I tell you exactly where I'm coming from. But we did include the voices of the people who would be okay with MAiD under the first track, that where death is imminent, people are suffering from a terminal illness, and their suffering is, according to them, unbearable. We included, for example, Michelle Sterling. People may know her as the communications director of Friends of Science. And her story was so important because her brother was suffering from a terminal degenerative illness, and he chose MAiD. And the family was very involved. They were not shut out of it. There were interviews to make sure there were no evidence of coercion taking place. It was a very holistic approach. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that's up to the individual. But even for Michelle, where her brother accessed MAiD versus where it is now, she says in the documentary, I'm mortified. I'm horrified that this is where it's gotten. And so for, religious pro-lifers like me, we were always talking about the slippery slope. We have to show where it started, and now we're showing where it's ending.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the responses to this, which is that the second category that we described is an inevitability from the first. And I think you look at a lot of the activists on this, originally when this was coming up before the Supreme Court, I mean, going back to the Rodriguez case, but more recently the Charter case, they kept it so narrow. And then the second they got that, it all of a sudden expanded. This is too restrictive. It's too difficult. We need to bring it more. And at a certain point, I mean, what's the next frontier? Because I actually don't believe we've hit rock bottom on this.
Not even close. Not even close. So the next frontier, I think, is probably mature minors. We've seen some precedent for that in recent Canadian history, where we have activists saying, yes, it is completely up to a 16-year-old to make all sorts of irreversible medical decisions about their body with regard to gender transition. So that's already out there. We also know that during the pandemic, there was this push to say that kids can go behind their parents' backs and get vaccinated. And if you look at what's happening in some of the other extreme MAiD regimes of the world, and I hate even calling it MAiD. I mean, it's euthanasia. It's government killing is what it really is. MAiD is just a euphemism to hide exactly what this is. But if we look at some of these other jurisdictions, we have followed in their footsteps almost directly. And so in Holland and Belgium, they're already euthanizing mature minors, and they're also euthanizing people who are just done with living. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not depressed. They're not anything. They're just over it. And so they are euthanizing those people too. And what we've seen Belgium and Holland take 2 decades to get to, we've accelerated into it in 5-6 years.
It's easy to look at Justin Trudeau and say all sorts of things about him and his government on this. But do you get a sense from your research of the why? Of what is it about the fabric of Canada that made us, basically the leader in a category I don't think we want to be leaders in on this issue, even, surpassing in some cases, certainly catching up to these European countries that always used to seem a world away when we did that comparison.
Yeah, I think, and I'm speculating here. I don't really know what's going on in the mind of Justin Trudeau. I don't know if Justin Trudeau knows what's going on in the mind of Justin Trudeau most days. But I think we've got a couple of different things at play here. So we've got a socialized healthcare system where rationing is built in. And with rationing comes delays in care. And with delays in care comes suffering. And so there has to be a solution to that suffering. And so a lot of people are opting to die rather than continue to wait and languish in the pain and suffering that our socialized medical system is offering them. So that's a thing, that this tidies up some wait lines with access to care. But also we've got this extreme focus on equality at all costs. And what I mean by that is the reason that MAiD is being expanded to encompass the mentally ill is this idea of recognizing the equality of suffering. So we've already said, look, if you're suffering from a physical, biological illness that is irremediable, then you should have access to government-assisted suicide. And so the health minister has said, well, we recognize that your mental suffering is completely on par with this irremediable physical suffering. And so thanks to this radical equality, we have to consider both illnesses to be the same. And so that's where we are now.
There's also an aspect culturally in Canada that I would posit and solicit your feedback on, which is that the government control of healthcare, the centralization of healthcare in Canada has, in a lot of ways, taken that moral ownership of healthcare away from Canadians. And some people are willingly going along with this. A lot of people will, cling to the Canadian healthcare system with their dying breath, ironically enough, even if the healthcare system contributed to the dying breath. But you have others that are frustrated with it. But regardless, we use... I mean, how often is a policy in Canada sold to us because, oh, well, if we don't do this, it's going to cost the healthcare system. If we don't do this, it's the justification for restrictions on junk food. It's the justification for everything. It's, well, we have to pay for the healthcare. So I think there is a cynicism that is fairly well supported in that, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, we just went through 3 years of lockdowns, and they said our strained healthcare system that we all have to pay for would not survive unless we listened to the guy in the white coat, or in Alberta's case, the lady with the harsh bangs at the podium every day telling us exactly what we needed to do to protect the healthcare system. So we have a society of, and there are still people doing those things, despite the fact that we are hearing more and more every day that the restrictions, by and large, didn't work and were just pulled out of the ether one day and then proliferated across society. And we were all following the lines on the floor as though the COVID only traveled in one direction, past the craft dinner. And so we've got an entire society of people who are still doing those things, meaning they are completely unskeptical about the guy in the white coat telling them what needs to happen with their health. And that worries me. That worries me because there's this sort of sinister passive suggestion to some people that we've heard about that, well, you know what? You're going to be suffering. You don't have long left. Listen to me. I'm a doctor. Maybe you should consider MAiD. That worries me because we have a story in our documentary of a family who were complete COVID skeptics. And thanks to their skepticism of doctors on TV and doctors saying things to them that didn't make sense, their grandma is alive today because she was sent to palliative care and she was suggested MAiD. And they said, no, no, no. And they kept going and going and going until they got an opinion that they thought made sense. And thanks to that, she's alive today. But on the flip side, we know now that there's a huge segment of the population that are just ready and willing to go along with the doctor in the white coat, no matter what that doctor says.
That story you shared from the documentary was quite a gripping one, where you had, multiple people in the healthcare system that had literally just, sentenced this woman to death by saying that, oh yeah, she's going to die, using that to then justify the idea that, oh well, death is imminent. So, and again, they just knew instinctively that something about that didn't make sense. And, there she was sitting down talking to you however long later. One thing I'm just curious about, because you, again, raised your hand on that, absolutist position on MAiD. You've also been unequivocal on, the issue of bodily autonomy throughout COVID. And I'm curious for you how you draw a line between the two, because this is where my libertarianism butts up against my belief in life as well, is that in the case with someone completely of sound mind, how do you say you shouldn't have this tool available to you legally?
Okay, so for me, the issue of bodily autonomy is also the same issue. Your natural life. For me, it's that I believe in the dignity of human life, and I believe in the integrity of the human body. And so I don't find my two positions indistinguishable. I think they're the same position. I don't think the government should be helping people die. It's terrible that we cannot prevent people from taking their own life. I think in our documentary, we offer solutions. Instead of waiting around for the government to change the culture around MAiD, we can do that in our own communities. But of course, I believe in bodily autonomy. I don't think the government should be telling you what to do with your body, but I also believe in the dignity and the value of the human being. And so that's kind of how I get my head around these two issues.
And even the dignity point is incredibly important, because even if one were to accept as a premise that there should be certain circumstances under which MAiD is legal and available, how many people of those who choose that would go that road if they were treated with dignity, if they felt like they had access to palliative care, if they felt they had a support system around them, if all of the options available were shared with them? And I think that's so key. And you see that same discussion with abortion, which is that, again, even if you believe it should be there as a point of last resort, a lot of people will not choose that if they have access to information along the way about alternatives.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, we don't discuss what palliative care is. It's a 50-year medical discipline, and it is making advances all the time in pain management. And so we have a lot of people in Canada who are scared about suffering, about the end of life. And look, I'll lead with my chin. I'm Catholic. We lean into the suffering, right? So I'm not scared of that. But I know a lot of people are scared of the pain of the end of life. And that is changing rapidly. And instead of putting money into palliative care, we're taking money out of palliative care to fund MAiD. And I think that is a great tragedy.
Sheila Gunn Reid, one of the producers of the newish documentary. It's not as new, but like I said, I wanted to see it first, and then I learned I could see it in person, so I wanted to do that. But it's called MAiD, The Dark Side of Canadian Compassion. Thank you so much for reaching out to me and allowing me to be a part of that in my own little way, Sheila. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Andrew, just thank you so much for being so raw and honest with us in that documentary. Your perspective was so vital to shed light on just, the other side of the mental health issue.
Well, it's kind of you to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.